Eastern Poland, May 1944. A single railway sapper crouches in darkness beside 60 tons of armored steel, and in his hands lies a problem every demolition manual said was impossible to solve. The rain has not stopped for 3 days, water sheets across the embankment pooling in the ballast stones, turning the clay beneath the ties into something close to liquid. Somewhere in the forest, 2 kilometers west, a German armored train idles on a siding, waiting for dawn, waiting for orders to roll east toward the partisan-held crossroads at Kovel. The train is a Panzerzug type BP-42, 8 cars long, 42 meters of riveted plate and gun turrets, carrying 2 76mm field pieces, 4 20mm autocannons, and 130 soldiers of the 5th Security Regiment. It has burned 11 villages in the past month. The sapper's name is Józef Kamiński. He is 26 years old. He's been a railway engineer for 4 years and a saboteur for 18 months. Tonight he has been given a mission that sits at the intersection of both lives: destroy the train before it reaches the junction, or accept that 200 civilians sheltering in Kovel will be shelled at first light. The problem is not the explosives. He has those. 6 kilograms of captured Wehrmacht TNT, standard-issue demolition blocks wrapped in waxed paper, fuses crimped and ready. The problem is not placement. He knows exactly where to set the charge, beneath the rail joint 300 meters ahead of the siding, where the track curves over a shallow culvert and the train will be traveling at 40 kilometers per hour, fast enough that derailment means catastrophe. The problem is ignition. Every fuse he carries is designed to burn at a rate of 30 seconds per meter. To give himself time to retreat to safe distance, minimum 200 meters, he needs at least 3 minutes of delay. That requires a 6-meter fuse, but the rain has soaked everything: the waxed canvas of his pack, the fabric of his jacket, the wooden ties beneath the rail. And fuse cord, no matter how carefully stored, absorbs moisture through its braided cotton sheath. Wet fuse does not burn cleanly. It sputters, it fails, and if it fails, the train rolls past unharmed and Józef dies in the woods, having accomplished nothing. He has tested 3 fuses already. All 3 died within 40 centimeters. Let us pause here and understand what an armored train represented in 1944. Germany operated 26 Panzerzüge on the Eastern Front, and everyone was a mobile fortress. The BP-42 design emerged in 1942 from lessons learned in Poland and the Ukraine, where earlier models, improvised affairs with sandbags and boilerplate, proved fatally vulnerable to partisan mines. The type BP-42 corrected those mistakes. Its armor was proper rolled steel, 20mm plates on the flanks, 30mm on the turrets, angled at 12 degrees to deflect small arms fire. The locomotive itself sat in the center of the train, shielded fore and aft by flat cars mounting anti-aircraft guns. Firing ports studded every carriage. Searchlights bracketed the roof. Crews lived on board for weeks at a time, supplied by trailing depot cars that carried ammunition, fuel, and rations for extended operations. These trains did not merely transport troops, they were weapons. They patrolled contested rail lines, interdicting supply columns and leveling resistance strongholds. A single Panzerzug could suppress partisan activity across 60 kilometers of track. They were hated with a specificity reserved for tools of systematic terror. The BP-42 that now waits on the siding near Kovel has a documented history. Its designation is Panzerzug 5, assigned to Army Group Center in March 1943. It participated in anti-partisan sweeps through the Pripet marshes that summer, destroying 14 suspected resistance camps and executing 237 civilians identified as collaborators. In October, it shelled the town of Sarny for 3 hours after partisans ambushed a supply convoy. In February 1944, it derailed a Soviet ammunition train near Brest, triggering secondary explosions that consumed an entire rail yard. The crew rotates every 6 weeks, but the train itself is permanent. It has a name painted on the locomotive in Gothic script: Eisenfaust, Iron Fist. Józef knows this. Everyone in the Armia Krajowa knows this. He also knows the statistics. Between January and April 1944, Partisan saboteurs on the eastern railways attempted 43 attacks on armored trains. 4 succeeded. The rest ended in failure. Broken fuses, mistimed detonations, charges placed too far from the rails to achieve derailment. 11 saboteurs were killed in the attempts. 5 were captured. The Wehrmacht made examples of them in public squares. The captured saboteurs were hanged from railway gantries. Their bodies were left for 3 days as warnings. Photographs were distributed to local populations. The message was explicit. The trains were invincible, and resistance was suicide. So the pressure is not abstract. It is historical. It is written in the wreckage of previous failures and the bodies of those who tried. Józef tests a 4th fuse. He cuts a 30-centimeter length, lights it with a match cupped against the wind, and watches the spark crawl along the cord. It travels 12 centimeters before the flame gutters and dies, choked by moisture trapped in the braid. He has one idea left, and it is not in any manual. It is not doctrine. It is something he remembers from his apprenticeship under the railway's chief engineer, a man named Wojciech, who died in a Gestapo prison in 1943. Wojciech once told him that fuse cord is just powder wrapped in cloth, black powder suspended in a cotton matrix. The powder needs oxygen to burn, but it also needs continuity. If water interrupts the powder train, combustion halts. But if you could isolate the powder from the moisture, seal it, even temporarily, you might sustain the burn long enough to reach the blasting cap. Wojciech had been talking about tunnel work, about running fuses through flooded shafts. The mines near Katowice occasionally filled with groundwater during spring thaws, and demolition crews needed ways to blast through collapsed sections without pumping entire galleries dry. Wojciech had experimented with various sealants, paraffin wax, tar, even animal fat rendered from slaughterhouse waste. None worked consistently. The wax cracked. The tar suffocated the flame. The fat oxidized too quickly and became a fire hazard itself. Wojciech never lived to test the theory completely. The Gestapo arrested him in January 1943 during a roundup of railway workers suspected of sabotage. He died under interrogation 6 days later. His body was returned to his family with a death certificate listing the cause as heart failure, though the bruising told a different story. Józef is going to test the theory now. He pulls a small tin from his pack, petroleum jelly, issued for rifle maintenance. Every partisan carries a tin. It prevents rust, lubricates bolt actions, protects metal from moisture during extended field operations. Józef has never used his entire supply. He maintains his weapon meticulously, but a little jelly goes far. The tin is 3/4 full. He unrolls a 6-meter length of fuse and begins working the jelly into the braid, massaging it through the weave with his fingers. The process is slow. The cord resists. The jelly is stiff in the cold, its consistency somewhere between solid and liquid. But gradually, the cotton darkens as the petroleum saturates the fibers, forming a slick, semi-waterproof sheath around the powder core. The technique is crude. He is essentially coating the fuse in grease, hoping the hydrophobic properties of the petroleum will repel water long enough for the flame to propagate through the powder train. There is no precision here, no measurement. He works by feel, forcing the jelly into the weave until the cord glistens in the faint moonlight filtering through the clouds. It is a desperate solution. He does not know if it will work. He does not know if the jelly will suffocate the flame or merely delay the inevitable failure. Petroleum jelly is not designed for this. It is a barrier substance meant to prevent interaction between moisture and metal. Whether it can sustain combustion through 6 meters of fuse cord is a question no one has answered, but it is the only solution he has. By the time he finishes, his hands are numb and black with grease. He wipes them on his trousers and checks his watch. 3:17. The train is scheduled to depart the siding at 4 o'clock. That gives him 43 minutes to place the charge, light the fuse, and reach minimum safe distance before the locomotive passes the detonation point. 43 minutes is both an eternity and no time at all. He moves quickly now, no hesitation. The TNT blocks go beneath the rail joint, wedged tight against the inside edge of the tie where the blast will shear the fasteners and lift the track. Rail demolition is geometry. The joint is the weak point, where 2 lengths of rail meet, bolted together through fish plates and secured by spikes driven at angles through the tie. A charge placed directly beneath the joint concentrates force at the point of maximum structural vulnerability. 6 kilograms of TNT will not vaporize the rail, but it will crack the fish plate and drive the spike heads upward through the wood, severing the connection between rail and tie. When the locomotive's leading wheels strike that gap, physics takes over. Józef secures the charge with wire, ensuring it cannot shift when the train's vibration begins. The blasting cap goes into the primary block, its leads crimp to the fuse terminals. The cap is a small copper cylinder filled with primary explosive, lead-azide, sensitive enough to detonate from the heat and shock of the burning fuse. Once the fuse reaches the cap, detonation is instantaneous. The cap sends a shock wave through the TNT, initiating the main charge. Then, the fuse itself, 6 meters of greased cord unspooled carefully to prevent kinks, the free end trailing back along the embankment into the cover of a drainage ditch 15 meters south. Kinks are death. A kinked fuse can trap moisture, create voids in the powder train, cause the flame to jump or extinguish entirely. Józef handles the cord like something alive, something fragile. He checks the placement twice. Everything is seated. Everything is firm. The charge sits in shadow beneath the rail, invisible unless you know where to look. The fuse runs along the ballast stones, disappearing into the ditch where wild grass and brambles provide concealment. From 20 meters away, there is nothing to see. Just track. Just ties. Just the rain-soaked geometry of infrastructure that has carried trains since 1938. Then he retreats to the ditch and waits. The rain continues. The forest is silent except for the hiss of water on leaves and the occasional crack of a branch bending under accumulated weight. Somewhere to the north, a bird calls. Some night creature undisturbed by the war that has consumed this landscape for 3 years. The sound is jarring in its normalcy. Józef lies in the mud and watches the track. His uniform is soaked through. Water runs down his collar and pools in his boots. He stopped feeling his toes an hour ago. These are the unwritten costs of sabotage. The cold, the wet, the hours of motionless waiting in conditions that erode the body even as the mind remains sharp. You learn to ignore discomfort. You learn to breathe slowly, to conserve heat, to keep your hands functional despite the numbness. At 3:47, he hears the first indications of movement from the siding. The diesel engine coughs, revs, settles into a steady thrum. Voices carry through the trees. German commands barked with the clipped efficiency of routine. The train is preparing to move. At 3:52, the locomotive's headlight ignites. A pale beam cuts through the rain, illuminating the track ahead in stark white relief. At 3:58, the armored train begins to move. Józef hears it before he sees it, the low throb of the locomotive's diesel engine, the metallic squeal of brake shoes releasing, the rhythmic clank of wheel flanges against rail joints. Then the searchlight appears, a white column sweeping the track ahead, illuminating the curve where the charge waits in the dark. The train is moving at walking speed, standard protocol for night operations on uncertain track. The crew has no reason to suspect sabotage here. This section of line has been quiet for weeks, but caution is ingrained. Armored trains are valuable assets. Crews are trained to advance slowly, to scan the rails, to watch for the telltale signs of tampering, disturbed ballast, fresh excavation, wire glinting in the searchlight beam. Józef does not breathe. The locomotive is 60 meters away, 50, 40. The searchlight sweeps past his position without pausing. He is invisible in the ditch, just another shadow among shadows. At 30 meters, the train begins to accelerate. The engineer has cleared the curve, confirmed the track is sound, and is increasing speed to operational tempo, 40 kilometers per hour, fast enough to maintain schedule, slow enough to retain control. It is time. Józef lights the fuse. The match flares. The flame catches the greased cord, and for 3 seconds, Józef watches the spark crawl forward, bright and steady, moving at the expected rate of 1 centimeter per second. Then the rain intensifies. A gust of wind drives water across the embankment, sheets of it, nearly horizontal. The flame flickers. It does not die, it dims, it wavers, but it continues. The petroleum jelly holds. The moisture beads on the surface of the cord without penetrating the braid. The powder train beneath burns on, insulated by the makeshift seal Józef has created with nothing but maintenance grease and desperate hope. For 5 seconds he watches, transfixed. The flame is a tiny orange dot in the darkness, advancing steadily toward the rail. Then instinct overrides fascination. He does not wait to see more. He runs, 200 meters south, into the trees, into the undergrowth where the soil is soft enough to absorb concussion. His boots slip on wet leaves, branches claw at his face. He does not slow. Behind him, the train's rumble grows louder. The locomotive is accelerating now, committed to speed, the engineer confident that the track ahead is clear. Józef counts seconds in his head. The fuse needs 180 seconds to burn. The train is moving at 40 kilometers per hour, 11 meters per second. If the timing is correct, the locomotive will be directly over the charge when the cap detonates. If mathematics is merciless. A 1-second error in fuse burn rate translates to 11 meters of displacement. If the fuse burns too fast, the charge detonates before the locomotive reaches it and the train passes over intact track. If it burns too slow, the locomotive passes the charge before detonation and the explosion damages only trailing cars. An inconvenience, not a kill. Józef has calculated for a nominal burn rate of 30 seconds per meter. But wet fuse, even waterproofed fuse, may burn slower. The moisture may retard combustion despite the jelly's protection. Or the jelly itself may alter the burn characteristics, creating unpredictable delays. He does not know. He has tested nothing. This is field improvisation at its most primitive, theory applied under pressure with no opportunity for verification. At 170 seconds, the forest erupts. The explosion is not loud. That is the first surprise. Józef expects thunder, something cinematic, something proportional to the violence he has initiated. What he hears instead is a sharp, flat crack, like a tree snapping in a windstorm, followed immediately by a shriek of tearing metal and the prolonged crash of derailing mass. The locomotive does not leap from the rails in a dramatic arc. It tilts. The blast shears the track at the joint, and the right-hand rail separates from the ties just as the locomotive's leading truck passes over the gap. The wheels drop into the ballast. The truck frame catches on the broken rail, and the entire engine pitches sideways, dragging the first gun car with it. Momentum carries the mass forward, even as the rails guide it into catastrophe. The second car jackknifes. The third car, still on the rails, collides with the wreckage of the second and folds like paper, its armor plates buckling under the compression of its own momentum. The train is traveling at 41 kilometers per hour when it begins to disintegrate. It takes 9 seconds to come to rest. In those 9 seconds, 60 tons of locomotive and 7 armored cars transform into debris. The engine capsizes into the culvert, its drive wheels spinning uselessly in the air, diesel fuel spraying from ruptured lines. The gun cars pile atop one another in a twisted mass of steel and splintered wood, turrets torn from their mounts, armor plates peeled back to reveal the fragile human cargo within. The trailing depot car, still upright, shears its coupling and rolls another 30 meters before friction brings it to a halt, rocking on its wheels before settling with a groan of stressed metal. Józef watches from the trees. He does not move closer. He does not need to. The train is dead. Men are screaming inside the wreckage. Józef can hear them even over the rain, shouts in German, commands and curses, and the thin cries of the injured. Flashlights appear, wavering beams cutting through the darkness as survivors attempt to assess the damage. A fire starts in the locomotive, fed by leaking diesel, and orange light paints the scene in flickering relief. But the train itself is silent. No engine thrum, no electrical hum. The searchlights are dark. The turrets are immobile, their guns pointing at useless angles toward the sky and the ground. Whatever command structure existed aboard Panzerzug 5 has disintegrated along with the rolling stock. Józef counts 15 men emerging from the wreckage in the first 5 minutes. Some are walking wounded, limping toward the rear of the train where the depot car offers shelter. Others are dragging injured comrades, leaving dark trails in the mud. A few simply sit on the embankment, stunned, staring at the carnage. No one is looking for saboteurs. Not yet. The immediate concern is survival, extracting the trapped, treating the injured, establishing a perimeter. The search for culprits will come later, once the shock subsides and the instinct for vengeance takes over. Józef does not wait for that transition. He retreats deeper into the forest, moving west toward the partisan camp at Lubień, where he will report the success and the method, the petroleum jelly, the greased cord, the fuse that burned in the rain. It is 4:14 on May 11, 1944. By nightfall, the story will spread. Let us consider what Józef's improvisation represented. Sabotage is, at its core, an engineering problem. Explosives are mathematics, yields and blast radii, pressure waves and fragmentation patterns. Fuses are chemistry, combustion rates and moisture tolerances, timing curves and failure modes. The saboteur's challenge is to apply those sciences under hostile conditions, in darkness, in weather, under time constraints that eliminate the luxury of testing and revision. Standard Doctrine provided solutions for dry conditions. Every resistance manual from SOE to NKVD included chapters on rail demolition, where to place charges for maximum effect, how to calculate fuse lengths for safe retreat, what blast patterns would guarantee derailment versus mere damage. The British Special Operations Executive published a handbook in 1942, 64 pages of technical specifications, illustrated with diagrams showing optimal charge placement for various rail configurations. The Soviet NKVD distributed similar materials to partisan units, adapted from pre-war mining and engineering texts. But Doctrine assumed stable conditions. It assumed dry fuses and predictable burns. It did not account for 3 days of rain in eastern Poland, for moisture-saturated cord, for the specific problem Józef faced on that embankment. The manuals included warnings about moisture, ensure all materials remain dry, and store fuses in waterproof containers, but offered no solutions when those precautions failed. So, he invented a solution, not from genius but from necessity. He took a material at hand, petroleum jelly, and repurposed it into a waterproofing agent. He tested nothing. He relied on theory, on half-remembered advice from a dead mentor, and on the hope that insulating the powder train would buy him the 3 minutes he needed. It worked, and in working, it became Doctrine itself. Within 2 weeks, the petroleum jelly technique appeared in Armia Krajowa training bulletins. The bulletins were mimeographed sheets passed hand to hand through partisan networks, never more than a few hundred copies, each one a security risk and a lifeline. The entry on fuse waterproofing was brief. In wet conditions, coat safety fuse with petroleum jelly or similar grease. Apply liberally to outer braid. Test before use if time permits. Method proven effective, May 1944. No attribution, no details, just the essential information that might keep someone alive. By June, Soviet partisan manuals included variations of the method, substituting beeswax or paraffin when petroleum jelly was unavailable. A captured German intelligence summary from July 1944 noted with frustration that partisan demolitions were succeeding even during heavy rain, suggesting new fusing techniques or materials not previously observed. The Wehrmacht never identified the specific innovation, only its effects. By August, SOE instructors in Bari were teaching the technique to operatives bound for the Balkans. A training memorandum from the SOE station included a demonstration. An instructor lighting a waterproofed fuse in a bucket of water, letting it burn submerged for 30 seconds before lifting it into air to complete combustion. The memo noted that several agents expressed skepticism until they witnessed the demonstration firsthand. The innovation cascaded outward, propagated not through formal channels, but through the desperate oral tradition of saboteurs sharing what kept them alive. 14 more armored trains were destroyed on the Eastern Front between May and September 1944. 7 of those attacks used waterproofed fuses. 3 others attempted the technique but failed due to improper application, insufficient jelly, inadequate saturation, or contamination of the powder train during handling. The failures were noted, the technique refined, the knowledge distributed. But let us return to the immediate aftermath. The Wehrmacht dispatched a recovery team to the derailment site within 6 hours. They arrived with a heavy crane, cutting torches, and a security detachment from the 213th Infantry Division, 200 men whose primary mission was not recovery but retaliation. The locomotive was unsalvageable. Its frame cracked, its boiler ruptured, its drive train shattered. Engineers inspected the wreckage and determined that the explosion had been placed with professional precision, directly beneath the rail joint where maximum structural damage could be achieved with minimum explosive. This was not amateur work. This was railway engineering turned to sabotage. The gun cars were towed away for scrap. What could not be moved was cannibalized, turret mechanisms stripped for parts, armor plates cut free for reuse, anything of value extracted before the hulks were burned. The depot car, intact but useless without an engine, was burned where it stood to deny its contents to partisans. 23 German soldiers died in the derailment, 12 in the initial crash as the locomotive's overturn crushed the forward gun car. 8 more from injuries sustained when the jackknifing cars compressed living spaces into killing zones. 3 from the fire that consumed the locomotive and spread to the adjacent wreckage before it could be controlled. 41 were injured seriously enough to require evacuation. Broken limbs, crush injuries, burns. The wounded were transported to a field hospital in Lublin, where 5 more died in the following week from complications. The rest walked back to the siding and waited for transport. The Wehrmacht executed 18 civilians in the nearest village as reprisal. This was policy. For every German soldier killed by partisans, the occupiers took hostages at a ratio of 5-to-1. The mathematics of terror were consistent. 23 soldiers killed meant 115 hostages required, but the village, Polnov, had a population of only 93. The Wehrmacht rounded up everyone they could find: men, women, elderly, children over the age of 14. 18 were selected by lottery. The rest were released with warnings. The executions took place in the village square at noon on May 12th. The condemned were hanged from a hastily erected scaffold. Their bodies were left for 3 days, guarded by a detachment of soldiers who prevented removal or approach. On the 4th day, the Wehrmacht cut them down and left them in a mass grave dug by surviving villagers. This was the pattern: attack, reprisal, escalation. Each act of resistance generated a response designed to make resistance too costly to sustain. The calculus was deliberate: make the civilian population suffer for partisan actions, and eventually they would withdraw support. It rarely worked. The reprisals hardened resolve more often than they broke it. But the Wehrmacht continued the policy because alternative strategies, negotiation, pacification, civic engagement, were philosophically incompatible with occupation doctrine. Józef did not witness the reprisals. He was 30 kilometers away by the time the recovery team arrived, debriefing his commander on the technique and the timing. The commander, a former Polish army lieutenant named Kowalski, listened carefully, asked technical questions about the petroleum jelly's consistency and application, then ordered the information distributed to other partisan cells operating along the rail network. Józef did not celebrate. Saboteurs did not celebrate. They recorded the success, noted the method, and prepared for the next mission. Celebration was a luxury afforded to those whose actions did not trigger reprisals. For saboteurs, success was measured in operational outcomes and survival rates, not in satisfaction. But the train did not reach Kovel. The junction held. And the 200 civilians sheltering there survived to evacuate south before the next Wehrmacht push. That was the calculation Józef had made, lying in the mud beside the track. 18 lives in Polnov against 200 in Kovel. The arithmetic was brutal. It was also unavoidable. Partisan operations existed in a state of permanent triage, choosing the least terrible option from a menu of horrors. He would conduct 4 more rail demolitions before the Soviet advance overtook the partisan zones in July. None required the petroleum jelly trick. Weather conditions were dry, standard fuses sufficed, but each mission carried the weight of reprisal, and each success meant civilians somewhere paid a price Józef would never witness. This is the moral geography of resistance. Victories measured in lives saved elsewhere, costs borne by communities who had no voice in the decision. But the technique remained in his kit, and he taught it to 3 other sappers before the war ended. One of those sappers, Leszek Gorski, used the method in Czechoslovakia in January 1945, destroying a munitions train bound for the Western Front during a blizzard that turned every fuse cord into a useless frozen rope. Gorsky waterproofed his fuse with candle wax, which he obtained from a church in a village whose name he never learned. The train was carrying 16 flat cars of 105mm artillery shells destined for the Ardennes offensive. The derailment triggered secondary explosions that consumed the entire train and destroyed a kilometer of track. Gorsky credited Józef by name in his after-action report, which was filed with the Soviet Partisan Command and subsequently archived in Moscow. The report is still there in a filing cabinet in the State Archive of the Russian Federation, where it will remain unless someone requests it specifically. Another sapper, whose name is lost, used the technique in Yugoslavia in March 1945, targeting a troop transport carrying SS reinforcements to the Sirmian front. The waterproofing method allowed him to light the fuse during a rainstorm and withdraw successfully. The train derailed on a mountain curve, and half the cars plunged into a ravine. Casualty figures were never confirmed, but partisan intelligence estimated 200 deaths. The third sapper taught the method to others, who taught it to others, and the chain of transmission dissolves into the chaos of the war's final months. Innovations in demolition rarely receive formal recognition. They do not appear in history books with the same prominence as tank designs or aircraft specifications. The Sherman tank is iconic. The T-34 is legendary. The B-17 has museums dedicated to it. But the petroleum jelly fuse? It exists in footnotes, in training manuals, in the oral histories of men and women who used it and survived to tell the story. Yet it shaped outcomes. A bridge that falls on schedule disrupts an offensive. A train that derails at the correct kilometer marker delays reinforcements. An ammunition dump that explodes denies supplies to frontline units. These are the hinge moments that accumulate into strategic effect. Józef's technique, born in rain and desperation, became one of those hinges. Let us examine the broader context. By the spring of 1944, the Eastern Front had become a war of infrastructure. The Wehrmacht could not hold territory without rail supply. Every division required 250 tons of supplies per day: ammunition, fuel, food, replacement equipment. Roads were inadequate. Mud consumed wheeled vehicles. Only rails could move the tonnage required to sustain mechanized warfare across a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The Soviet advance depended on captured rolling stock. As the Red Army pushed west, it requisitioned German locomotives, repaired damaged track, and converted the rail gauge from European standard to Soviet broad gauge. Entire battalions were dedicated to railway reconstruction, moving behind the front lines with prefabricated track sections and portable bridges. And between the two armies, in the contested no-man's land of Poland and the western USSR, partisans waged a parallel campaign to deny the rails to both sides. The rail war was invisible to most combatants, unrecorded in official histories, but its effects rippled through every supply calculation and operational plan. Armored trains were Germany's answer to that campaign. They represented mobile interdiction, a way to patrol rail lines without committing static garrisons. A single Panzerzug could cover 60 kilometers of track in a day, responding to reports of partisan activity, escorting critical shipments, and suppressing resistance through overwhelming firepower. But their effectiveness depended on predictability. Trains follow tracks, tracks follow terrain, and terrain can be prepared. Every derailment was a calculus problem. The saboteur estimated the train's speed, the timing of its passage, the placement of the charge. Get it right, and the train died. Get it wrong, and the saboteur died. Józef got it right. But the success was not inevitable. It hinged on a makeshift solution to a moisture problem that no manual addressed. It hinged on his willingness to test an unproven theory under conditions that offered no second chances. It hinged on luck, the specific viscosity of the petroleum jelly, the specific rate at which it saturated the fuse braid, the specific timing of the rain's intensity as the flame crawled toward the blasting cap. Any one variable could have failed. None did. After the war, Józef returned to railway work. He took a position with the Polish State Railways as a track maintenance supervisor, overseeing repairs on the same lines he had once sabotaged. The irony was not lost on him. He spent the late 1940s and early 1950s rebuilding infrastructure he had helped destroy, replacing rails he had blown apart, repairing bridges he had collapsed. He did not speak often about his partisan service. When asked, he described it in technical terms: fuse lengths, blast radii, clearance distances. He avoided drama. He avoided heroism. He especially avoided discussing the reprisals, the civilians killed in retaliation for his actions. That weight he carried privately. His colleagues knew he had been in the resistance. Most railway workers had been, in one capacity or another, but they did not press for details. The immediate post-war years were a time of reconstruction, not reflection. Poland had lost 6 million people, a fifth of its population. The country needed railways, not stories. Józef married in 1947. His wife, Maria, had been a courier for the Armia Krajowa, carrying messages between partisan cells. They met at a railway union meeting and discovered their networks had occasionally overlapped during the war, though they had never met in the field. They did not talk much about those years. They built a life instead. 2 daughters, born in 1949 and 1952, a small house near the rail yards in Gdansk, a routine of work and family that slowly buried the war under the accumulation of ordinary days. In 1963, a military historian from the University of Warsaw interviewed him for a project on resistance engineering. The historian, a young professor named Wielki, was compiling a technical analysis of partisan demolition methods, hoping to document innovations that had emerged from field conditions. He had heard about the petroleum jelly technique through a reference in a Soviet archive and traced it back to Józef through a chain of after-action reports. The interview took place in Józef's living room, over coffee and cigarettes, while Maria listened from the kitchen. Wielki asked about the armored train derailment and the petroleum jelly technique. Józef's response was recorded in the archive notes. "It was not clever," he said. "It was available. The jelly was in my pack. The fuse was wet. I put them together because there was no alternative." The historian pressed him. Was he nervous? Did he believe it would work? "I believed I had 3 minutes to find out," Józef said. "After that, it did not matter what I believed." Wielki asked if he considered himself brave. Józef was silent for a long moment. Then, "Brave is the wrong word. Committed, maybe. Desperate, certainly. But brave suggests a choice made freely. I did not feel I had a choice. The train had to be stopped. The method was uncertain. I did what the situation required." This is the voice of the engineer, not the hero. The pragmatist who solves the problem in front of him and moves on. The individual for whom success is not vindication, but merely the absence of failure. It is also the voice of someone who understood that war is not a sequence of grand gestures, but an accumulation of small, technical victories, each one insignificant in isolation, each one essential in aggregate. Wielki published his findings in 1965 in an academic journal with a circulation of perhaps 300. The article was titled "Field Innovations in Partisan Demolition Techniques, 1943 to 1945. Józef's name appeared once in a footnote, credited with the petroleum jelly waterproofing method. The article was never translated. It exists in Polish academic archives, unread except by specialists. Józef died in 1979. His obituary in the Gdansk Railway Union newsletter mentioned his decades of service, his role in post-war reconstruction, and his wartime record. It did not mention the petroleum jelly. It did not mention the armored train. It did not mention Panzerzug 5 or the 18 civilians executed in Polnów. It noted that he was survived by 2 daughters and 4 grandchildren, and that his colleagues remembered him as a man who solved problems quietly and taught others to do the same. That is perhaps the better monument, because the legacy of the wet fuse hack is not in the single train Józef destroyed. It is in the technique itself, in the way a desperate solution became standard practice, in the way knowledge propagated through the chaotic networks of resistance movements that rarely had time to document what they learned. How many saboteurs waterproofed fuses after May 1944? The records are fragmentary, archives burned, agents died, but the technique appears in Soviet partisan after-action reports from Belarusia, in Yugoslav Chetnik demolition logs, in Greek ELAS training notes from the Civil War. Each instance is a ripple from that original innovation on a rain-soaked embankment in Poland, and each instance is a testament to the same principle, that war is shaped not only by strategy and production, but by the ingenuity of individuals who refuse to accept that a problem is unsolvable. The armored train that Józef destroyed was not replaced. The Wehrmacht reassigned the 5th Security Regiment to a different sector and suspended Panzerzug patrols on the Kovel line until Soviet forces overran the junction in July. The gap in coverage allowed partisan columns to move more freely, to interdict convoys without fear of concentrated retaliation, to establish supply routes that would prove critical during the Soviet summer offensive. How many lives did that save? The number is incalculable. But we can trace some of the effects. In June 1944, partisan units in the Kovel sector conducted 17 ambushes against German supply columns. Without armored train patrols to suppress their movement, they operated with relative impunity. 12 of those ambushes succeeded, destroying 83 vehicles and killing or capturing 271 German soldiers. The Wehrmacht was forced to divert infantry from frontline positions to escort convoys, weakening defensive lines just as the Soviet offensive began. When Operation Bagration launched on June 23rd, the absence of secure rail transport in the Kovel sector contributed to the collapse of Army Group Center's southern flank. Reinforcements that should have arrived in days took weeks. Ammunition stocks ran low, fuel became scarce. The Wehrmacht attempted to run emergency supply trains through the contested zone, but partisan attacks destroyed 4 of 7 trains before they reached their destinations. By mid-July, Soviet forces had advanced past Kovel and were pushing toward the Vistula. The rail junction that Józef had helped protect became a Soviet logistics hub, supporting the drive into Poland. German forces retreated west, abandoning equipment they could not evacuate, burning depots they could not defend. One sapper, one train, one innovation that rippled forward through time and space, affecting operations far beyond its immediate effect. But there is another legacy, less tangible but equally important. After the war, railway workers throughout Poland carried the knowledge of what could be done. They knew that infrastructure was not invincible, that clever application of basic materials could overcome significant obstacles, that improvisation was not weakness but necessity. This knowledge shaped post-war reconstruction in ways both practical and philosophical. When the Polish state railways faced seemingly impossible repair challenges, bridges destroyed, tunnels collapsed, track torn up for hundreds of kilometers, the engineers did not wait for perfect materials or ideal conditions. They improvised, they adapted, they used what was available and made it work. The same mindset that created the petroleum jelly fuse informed the reconstruction of an entire national rail network. Józef supervised track crews that replaced 400 kilometers of rail between 1946 and 1951. His crews worked through winters that froze the ground solid, through shortages that left them without proper tools, through bureaucratic tangles that delayed material shipments for months. They improvised constantly. When rail spikes were unavailable, they fabricated substitutes from salvaged metal. When ballast stone ran short, they used crushed brick from bombed buildings. When standard repair techniques failed, they invented new ones. This was the culture of wartime resistance transplanted into peacetime reconstruction, the refusal to accept that obstacles were insurmountable, the willingness to test unproven methods, the understanding that perfect solutions were luxuries rarely available. One of Józef's daughters, Anna, born in 1949, became a civil engineer. She specialized in bridge construction and spent her career designing spans across rivers and valleys throughout Poland. In a 1998 interview for an engineering magazine, she was asked about her father's influence on her career choice. "He taught me that engineering is problem-solving under constraints," she said. "You rarely have ideal conditions. You work with what you have, you test, you adapt. You find solutions that are good enough to work, even if they are not elegant." She did not mention the war. She did not mention sabotage, but the philosophy was the same. Improvisation as discipline, adaptation as expertise, the recognition that theoretical perfection matters less than practical success. This is how innovations propagate across generations, not through formal instruction, but through transmitted values, not through written doctrine, but through demonstrated practice. Let us return finally to the physics of what Józef accomplished. A fuse is a simple device. At its core, it is nothing but a tube of fabric filled with black powder, potassium nitrate, sulfur, and charcoal in specific ratios. The powder burns at a predictable rate when ignited, producing heat and gas that propagate along the tube. The fabric serves as containment, keeping the powder compressed and directing the combustion in one direction. Water disrupts this mechanism. Moisture penetrates the fabric, dissolving the potassium nitrate and creating voids in the powder train. When the flame reaches a void, it has nowhere to go. The heat dissipates, the combustion halts, the fuse fails. Petroleum jelly counteracts this by creating a hydrophobic barrier. The petroleum molecules repel water molecules, preventing them from penetrating the fabric. The barrier is not perfect. Water can still seep through given enough time, but it is sufficient to maintain powder continuity for the duration of a burn cycle. The technique works because petroleum jelly has specific properties that make it ideal for this application. It is viscous enough to adhere to fabric without running off. It is stable across a wide temperature range, remaining semi-solid in cold conditions and not liquefying in heat. It is chemically inert, not reacting with the powder components or altering their combustion characteristics. And it is available, standard issue in military maintenance kits, carried by virtually every soldier and partisan. Józef did not understand the chemistry. He did not need to. He understood the practical principle. Create a barrier between water and powder, and the fuse might burn. That intuition, combined with materials at hand, produced a solution that worked. This is engineering at its most fundamental. Not the application of complex theory, but the practical manipulation of materials to achieve specific outcomes. It is the same process that produced the wheel, the lever, the wedge. Observations about how things behave, translated into tools that exploit those behaviors. The petroleum jelly fuse is not revolutionary in the sense of introducing new physics. It is revolutionary in the sense of recognizing that existing physics could be manipulated in ways doctrine had not anticipated. It is innovation as recombination, taking known materials and using them in novel configurations to solve immediate problems. And it worked not once but repeatedly, in conditions ranging from Polish rain to Yugoslav blizzards to Greek downpours. The technique proved robust across environments because it addressed a fundamental problem, moisture infiltration, with a fundamental solution, barrier protection. By 1946, petroleum jelly waterproofing had appeared in official training manuals. The British Army's demolition handbook included a section on fuse protection in adverse conditions, recommending petroleum jelly or similar substances as temporary moisture barriers. The Soviet military published similar guidance in 1947. The technique had transitioned from field improvisation to institutional knowledge. But the manuals did not credit Józef. They could not. The innovation had no single author. It had emerged from the collective desperation of saboteurs facing similar problems in similar conditions, and it had propagated through networks that left no documentary trail. Józef was the first, or perhaps merely the first, whose success was documented, but others likely discovered the same solution independently. This is how most wartime innovations work. They emerge from necessity, spread through informal channels, and eventually crystallize into doctrine without clear attribution. The individual inventor matters less than the collective adoption. What matters is that the solution worked and that others learned from it. In the decades after the war, military historians attempted to catalog partisan innovations, techniques developed in field conditions that later influenced formal doctrine. The petroleum jelly fuse appeared in several such catalogs, always with uncertain provenance. Some sources credited Soviet partisans, others mentioned Polish resistance, a few referenced Yugoslav Chetniks. None agreed on specifics. Józef never corrected these accounts. He read some of them. Colleagues occasionally sent him articles or books mentioning rail sabotage, but he did not seek recognition. By the time historians were documenting these techniques, he was decades into civilian life, focused on reconstruction and family, uninterested in claiming credit for something that had emerged from desperation rather than inspiration. He did tell the story to his daughters, but only once when Anna asked him directly about his wartime service. She was 16, studying history in school, learning about the occupation and resistance. She wanted to know what her father had done. He told her about the train, about the rain, about the fuse that would not light and the improvisation with petroleum jelly. He told her about the explosion and the aftermath. He did not tell her about Polnov. He did not tell her about the 18 civilians executed in reprisal. Some weights were not meant to be shared. Anna remembered the story. Years later, when she worked on a bridge project that required setting charges in a flooded quarry, she recalled her father's improvisation. The explosives crew was having trouble with wet fuses. Standard waterproofing methods were failing. Anna suggested petroleum jelly. The crew tried it. It worked. She called her father that evening and told him his wartime technique had helped complete a peacetime bridge. He laughed, a rare sound, and said, "I suppose some things remain useful even when the world changes." This is the quiet legacy of wartime improvisation. Not monuments or medals, but transmitted knowledge that continues to solve problems long after the original context has vanished. The petroleum jelly fuse matters not because it destroyed an armored train in 1944, but because it represents a mode of thinking. The refusal to accept failure when alternatives exist, the willingness to test unproven methods, the understanding that available materials can be repurposed for unexpected applications. These principles outlive wars. They inform reconstruction, infrastructure development, emergency response, disaster recovery. They are the invisible inheritance of generations forced to improvise under impossible conditions. Let us conclude where we began. With Józef in the rain, holding a problem every manual said was impossible to solve. The train burned for 3 hours before the fire consumed the depot car. Józef was long gone by then, moving through forests that would be battlefields within 8 weeks, carrying in his memory the knowledge that sometimes the solution is not in the manual. Sometimes it is in your pack. Sometimes 3 minutes is enough time to change the outcome if you are willing to test what no one else has proven. The wreckage of Panzerzug 5 was finally cleared in August 1944 after Soviet forces overran the sector. Engineers salvaged what they could: scrap metal, undamaged weapons, anything with resale or reuse value. The locomotive was cut apart with torches and hauled away in pieces. The gun cars were stripped and abandoned. The site was marked on Soviet military maps as a successful partisan action, one of hundreds that occurred along the eastern railways during the occupation. No monument was erected. No plaque commemorates the event. The rail line was rebuilt and remains in service today, carrying freight and passenger trains between Ukraine and Poland. Travelers passing through the curve near Polnov see only track and forest, unaware that beneath the modern ballast lies the ghost of an innovation born in desperation. Eastern Poland, May 1944. A greased fuse burns in the rain, and 60 tons of armored steel learns that certainty is an illusion. One sapper solves an impossible problem with maintenance grease and determination. The train dies. The technique lives. And somewhere in the accumulated weight of small victories, the outcome of a war shifts by degrees too subtle to measure, but too significant to ignore. The rest is trajectory. The rest is legacy. The rest is the quiet knowledge that infrastructure is never permanent, that innovation emerges from necessity, and that sometimes the most important contributions are the ones no one remembers to record. Józef Kamiński died in 1979, having rebuilt more track than he destroyed, having taught more people than he fought, having lived long enough to see his grandchildren grow up in a Poland where trains ran on schedule and no one fled from their approach. That, too, is victory. Quieter than explosions, more durable than steel, measured not in destruction, but in the ordinary peace of a reconstruction completed and a life fully lived. The fuse burned, the train fell, the war moved on. And in the space between improvisation and doctrine, between necessity and innovation, between one man's desperate solution and a generation's inherited knowledge, lies the real story of how small acts accumulate into history.